Carl Jung didn't just believe in God, he knew. And when he said this on national television, on the BBC in 1959, he wasn't making a philosophical provocation or a statement of blind faith. He was asserting something he experienced with the force of inner certainty. The phrase, "I don't believe, I know," delivered with serenity and a slight smile, landed like a bombshell in the world of psychology. After all, how could a scientist, so recognized for his analytical rigor, make such an absolute statement about the spiritual? But Jung wasn't talking about dogma. He was talking about an experience so intense and present that the verb believe was no longer sufficient. Knowing, for him, was the result of having dived into the deepest parts of the human soul, and having found there something that transformed everything. The impact was immediate. At the time, the statement generated discomfort, criticism, and even mockery among his peers. Many didn't know how to deal with someone who seemed to cross the boundaries between science and spirituality without asking permission. But Jung no longer cared about these boundaries. For him, the human psyche wasn't separate from the sacred. It was the path to it. Knowing didn't mean knowing a divine figure as an external character. It was recognizing the presence of something greater that inhabits us, that moves us, that interferes in our life even when we ignore it. And this, he said, is accessible to anyone who has the courage to look within. Jung spoke of a type of experience that can't be put into words, but that transforms. A certainty that doesn't come from outside, but emerges from the depths of one's being, like an ancestral memory or a light that ignites in the inner darkness. When he stated that he knew, he was referring to this deep and direct connection with something that escapes the control of the ego, something that often only appears when life brings us to our knees, when all rational mechanisms fail and all that remains is the encounter with one's own soul. And it's there, at that exact point, that our journey with him begins. Because understanding what Jung meant by knowing God is also understanding what he discovered about ourselves. For Jung, God wasn't an old bearded man in the sky, nor a mystical entity outside of us. God was a symbol. And not just any symbol, but the most powerful and universal of all time. He represented that which is beyond rational understanding, that which attracts and frightens us at the same time. God for Jung was a psychic image, a reflection of what is greater than the ego can comprehend. This didn't make his existence less real. On the contrary, it made him even more essential, because he was experienced as direct, internal, unquestionable experience. It was less about dogma, more about presence, less about faith, more about psychic transformation. This symbol, that of God, appears repeatedly in cultures, religions, and mythologies because it is born from the collective unconscious. It's a force that manifests with different names, forms, and narratives, but always carries the same essence. Something that guides us, challenges us, and calls us to grow. Jung said that literal language cannot account for this experience. That's why we use symbols, crosses, lights, thrones, storms. They are human attempts to translate the ineffable, the untouchable. They are maps for something that can only be truly understood when experienced from within. That's why for him, all religion is valid, as long as it is lived as a symbol and not as a prison. When we understand that God is a symbol of something that pulses in our psyche, we stop looking outside for what can only be found within. Jung teaches us to change the question, do you believe in God? To, do you connect with what transcends you? The answer doesn't require blind faith, it requires an inner dive. And when that dive happens, the symbol ceases to be just an idea and becomes an encounter. An encounter with a greater force, yes, but also with the totality of who we are. And it's at this point that God and the self become confused. Both are different names for the mysterious center of our soul. In his house in Küsnacht, Switzerland, Jung did something that many would never dare. He engraved above the door the phrase, "Vocatus atque non vocatus, Deus aderit." In Latin, called or not called, God will be present. This gesture says a lot about how Jung understood spirituality. For him, the sacred doesn't depend on rituals, beliefs, or conscious invitations. God, or rather, the inner spiritual force that guides us, is always there, latent, even when we ignore it. This phrase is almost a warning, a permanent reminder that there is something in us that never sleeps, something that observes us and participates in our decisions, even without being named. Jung didn't see this presence as something distant or exclusively religious. He believed that the divine manifests in every aspect of human experience, in dreams, in pains, in unexpected encounters, in crises that break us and remake us. God, for him, is a psychic constant, a symbolic presence that is always operating in the shadows of consciousness. And precisely because he is always present, spirituality is not a matter of rational choice. It's an existential condition. All of us, whether we want to or not, are in contact with the sacred. The question is whether we perceive this or continue anesthetized. This recognition of the constant presence of the divine transforms our way of living. When we understand that the sacred is not something to be conquered or sought, but rather something that has accompanied us all along, everything changes. The most important questions in life are no longer, does God exist, or which religion is right, but become, how am I relating to this greater force within me? Am I listening to the call that inhabits me? Jung didn't want to convince us of a belief. He wanted to awaken us to an inner reality that is already happening, and that only depends on us paying more attention. For Jung, everything we say about God is symbolic because the mystery he represents is beyond human understanding. Language, however refined it may be, is a limited instrument in the face of the infinite. God, like the soul, cannot be contained in fixed words, rigid doctrines, or logical definitions. What remains for us is metaphor. That's why the Bible, myths, and even fairy tales, in Jung's view, carry a deeper truth than they appear to. They are doors to invisible dimensions of the psyche, reflections of what stirs in the collective unconscious. These metaphors are not just figures of speech, but powerful tools of transformation. When we hear the story of a hero who dies to be reborn, of a God who descends to the underworld and returns with wisdom, or of a soul that faces its own demons, something within us recognizes itself. It's as if we were seeing, through the images, pieces of our own journey. Jung called this the symbolic function, the capacity that a symbol has to activate deep inner processes. And the more a symbol touches the center of the self, the more power it has to guide us toward integration and self-knowledge. Therefore, Jung invites us to look at sacred texts, rituals, and religious traditions, not with the eyes of dogma, but with the eyes of the soul. The question is not, is this literal truth? But rather, what does this awaken in me? God, understood as a symbolic mystery, ceases to be the monopoly of religion and becomes a living experience within each person. When we accept that spiritual truth communicates through images and stories, we access a new type of wisdom, one that doesn't need to be proven, only lived. And in this symbolic experience, God ceases to be a concept and becomes a transforming presence. At the center of Jungian psychology is the archetype of the self, a deep image of the totality of the soul, which includes both light and shadow. For Jung, this self is the symbol closest to what religions call God. It's not outside of us, but pulses from birth within us. When we disconnect from it, we feel emptiness, anxiety, confusion of purpose. But when we manage to reestablish this connection, we are taken by a sense of meaning, unity, and transformation. It's not an exaggeration to say that for Jung, reconnecting with the self was having a direct experience with the sacred. This self is not the ego, The ego is small, insecure, full of defenses. Full. The self is vast, mysterious, and often terrifying because it knows what we need, not what we want. It calls us to a journey of self-knowledge that demands courage, renunciation, and surrender. When coming into contact with this psychic center, a person begins to perceive that there is something greater guiding their story, something that often goes against conscious will. It is at this point that Jung states, God is not contained in religion, he is contained in the heart of man. The self is the portal to this presence, and when Jung quotes the famous passage of Jesus, "The kingdom of God is within you," he's pointing exactly to this. Spirituality, in the end, is not a set of beliefs, but an inner relationship. Knowing the self is knowing God in his most intimate form. It's discovering that there is a guiding force within us that desires our fullness. But for this, we need to abandon the illusions of the ego and allow the self to take the helm. This is not an easy task, but it is, for Jung, the true spiritual journey of the human soul. Jung believed that in the modern world, God has ceased to inhabit temples and has begun to manifest directly in people's souls. God has fallen from religion and entered the human heart, he wrote. This means that with the fall of the authority of organized religions, many began to seek the sacred individually. But this change, although liberating, is also dangerous. Without a symbolic structure to deal with the forces of the unconscious, the modern individual can get lost in their own inner labyrinth. Spirituality, which was previously guided by myths and rituals, now needs to be lived as a direct and personal experience. The contemporary crisis, marked by anxiety, depression, a sense of emptiness, and loss of meaning, is, for Jung, the symptom of a disconnection from this deeper dimension of existence. We live in an era where myths have died, traditions have weakened, and reason has become the only compass. But the human spirit needs more than logic. It needs meaning. And it's precisely this search for meaning that reveals the new place of God, no longer in external doctrines, but in intimate dialogue with the unconscious itself. A silent call that demands listening, courage, and openness. Without this contact with what is greater than us, we risk living adrift, hostages to a superficial and automated existence. Jung saw this clearly and warned, when the sacred is not consciously recognized, it manifests in destructive ways, as addictions, existential crises, toxic relationships, chronic fear. In other words, the sacred doesn't disappear, it just changes its face. And if we're not able to look inside and listen to what is asking for passage, life will take care of screaming through pain. That's why Jung said that, more than ever, modern human beings need a new relationship with the sacred. The hero's journey, so well known in mythology, is also the core of Jung's theory of individuation. This process is not just psychological, it's deeply spiritual. Jung saw human development as a symbolic path, where each phase of life represents a call to transformation. And just as in myths, this path requires a descent into the underworld, the confrontation with the shadow, suffering, the loss of ego. True spirituality for him is not an escape from pain, but a crossing through it. Because it's at the bottom of the well, in the darkness of the soul, that the awakening of the new self begins. This new self, the self, only emerges after the collapse of the illusions that sustained the old ego. It's like dying to be reborn. Jung saw this dynamic mirrored in the story of Christ. Crucifixion represents the end of the ego, resurrection, the emergence of an expanded consciousness. Not by chance, he said that the Christian myth was happening today, now within each of us. Each phase of Jesus' life, birth, exile, miracles, death, return, is a living metaphor of the stages of the soul in search of completeness. And this search is not reserved for saints or the enlightened. It is the call of all of us. Jung drew attention to a powerful detail. The disciples didn't immediately recognize the resurrected Christ. This symbolizes something essential. When we are reborn in our own lives, the new self that emerges can be strange even to ourselves. True transformation confuses, frightens, challenges, but it is what brings us closer to our essence. Therefore, the journey of individuation is not just a search for psychological balance. It's a mystical crossing, passing through the internal hell to reach a type of heaven that is not outside, but inside. And it's in this crossing that the hero reveals themselves, not as someone perfect, but as someone whole. Jung saw Christianity not as a dogma to be followed, but as a profound symbol of the process of inner transformation. The story of Jesus was, for him, an archetypal reflection of the journey of the human soul. It didn't matter so much if the events were historical, but rather what they represented psychologically. The crucifixion, for example, was the collapse of the ego, the descent into hell, the plunge into the shadows of the psyche, and the resurrection, the rebirth of a new, more integrated identity, closer to the self. This symbolic reading gave Christianity a living force, current, present in every moment of crisis and rebirth in our lives. Jung believed that the true spiritual meaning of Christianity manifested in the unconscious, in a dimension where linear time does not exist. For him, the story of Christ didn't just happen 2,000 years ago. It happens now, within each person who faces the pain of transformation. The birth of the new self is not immediate. Just as the disciples didn't recognize the resurrected Christ, we also have difficulty recognizing when something new and true is being born within us. It takes time, silence, and listening to welcome this new consciousness that emerges after the old collapses. This symbolic gaze completely transforms our relationship with religion. Instead of following external rules, we are invited to live the myth from within. The cross ceases to be a symbol of passive suffering and becomes a portal of transmutation. The empty tomb doesn't just represent the victory of faith, but the possibility of freeing ourselves from structures that no longer serve us. Jung rescued Christianity as an internal map, as a living myth, and in doing so, he gave us a precious key. Every time we face chaos, pain, and loss of meaning, we are being called to resurrect at a new level of consciousness, deeper, more real, more our own. Throughout his career, Jung analyzed more than 80,000 dreams, and it was through them that he perceived a pattern. Symbols such as the sun, the moon, the ocean, the cross, the serpent, the hero, and the wise old man appeared repeatedly, regardless of a person's culture or religion. These symbols were not random creations of the mind, but expressions of what he called the collective unconscious, a deep layer of the human psyche, shared by all humanity. And in this symbolic reservoir, Jung found God, not as an entity outside of us, but as a psychic force that manifests through these universal archetypes. These dreams, visions, and intense experiences with the sacred carried such a rich symbolic structure that Jung understood that there was something much bigger at play. The human psyche seemed to be organized to reconnect with a spiritual dimension. It was as if, within us, there existed a secret compass pointing to the sacred. Not a sacred imposed from outside, but one that springs from within, spontaneously, in dreams, in crises, in intuitions. Religious symbols, which appear so frequently in our psychic lives, are not illusions. They are manifestations of something essential to our existence, the desire for integration, for meaning, for wholeness. When a person dreams of intense lights, temples, celestial figures, or even encounters with religious figures, Jung didn't interpret this as delusion. He saw there a call, a contact with the self, with that which needs to emerge to guide inner transformation. These symbols are like beacons in the darkness of the soul. They point the way, even if they don't explain it. And the more a person approaches these symbols with respect and openness, the more they can transform their pain into meaning, their confusion into clarity, their suffering into direction. That's why Jung said, By diving into the unconscious, we can find not only our wounds, but also the God who can heal them. Jung saw religion as a symbolic language of the psyche, humanity's attempt to express that which cannot be explained rationally. The very word religion comes from the Latin religare, which means to reconnect, to bind again. But reconnect with what? For Jung, with the totality of the soul. Religion, in this sense, was not a set of doctrines to be blindly followed, but a symbolic structure capable of guiding us toward integration. And this reconnection was not just spiritual, it was also psychological. It was the attempt to restore the bond between consciousness and the unconscious forces that inhabit us. Analyzing different religious traditions, Jung realized that they all pointed in the same direction, the reconciliation of opposites within the human being. Heaven and hell, light and shadow, masculine and feminine, spirit and matter. These pairs, far from being enemies, are part of the soul's dance in search of wholeness. Religion, when lived as a symbol, helps to build this bridge. It offers rituals, images, and stories that activate unconscious forces and place us before fundamental questions. Who am I? Where am I going? What is the meaning of suffering? These questions don't have logical answers, but they have symbolic answers. When understood as an inner path, religion becomes a powerful ally in the process of individuation. It doesn't impose answers, it proposes encounters. Encounters with mystery, with silence, with what is deepest in us. Therefore, Jung didn't reject religion, he reinterpreted it. He said that it could be a bridge to the self, as long as it was lived with consciousness. And, above all, that it wasn't used to avoid suffering, but to transform it, because in the end, all true religion speaks of transformation, and all true transformation requires that we reconnect with what is most sacred within us. For Jung, God wasn't a defined or personified being. He was an unknown factor that crossed human consciousness with such force that it couldn't be ignored. I don't know if there is a specific God, Zeus, Jehovah, Allah. I know there is something that surpasses me, that changes the course of my life, and this I call God, he wrote. This force doesn't respond to logic, doesn't fit within the limits of thought. It manifests when we are surprised by something stronger than us, an intense emotion, a sudden crisis, a twist that escapes our control. In these hours, as Jung said, even the most skeptical whispers, "Oh God." This God is the word we give to that which interrupts our plans and forces us to look within. It's the psychic force that knocks down the ego and reveals the presence of something greater, something that calls us to grow, even if initially through pain. Jung recognized this presence when he felt dominated by overwhelming emotions such as fear, anger, deep love, or creative ecstasy. These experiences are not just emotional discharges, they are encounters with the sacred. They show us that we are not in control, that there is a dimension within us that operates by laws that we still don't fully understand. Therefore, Jung proposed a more honest, more psychological, and deeply human spirituality. Instead of seeking fixed definitions or external images, he invited us to observe our most intense experiences and recognize in them the action of the sacred. Jung's God is the name he gives to that which breaks us and at the same time builds us. It's the force that leads us to truth, even when everything seems to be falling apart. By admitting that he didn't know exactly what God was, but that he knew of his existence, Jung was offering us not a belief but an experience, a way of looking within and recognizing something inhabits me and that something is guiding my journey. At the end of his journey, Jung doesn't position himself as a believer or a non-believer. He positions himself as someone who has experienced. His famous phrase, "I don't need to believe in God," I know is not a theological provocation, but a testimony of someone who has traversed the unconscious and returned transformed. For Jung, knowing God is perceiving the continuous presence of a force that transcends the ego and guides life, with a wisdom that the conscious mind cannot fabricate. This force manifests in symbols, dreams, rituals, pains, and in moments when we are forced to let go of control and trust in something deeper. This trust is not passive. It requires surrender, but also lucidity. Jung didn't propose that we surrender to any impulse or uncontrolled emotion, but that we recognize when something greater than the ego is acting in us. He called this a direct experience with the sacred, not mediated by religions, nor by books, nor by doctrines, an experience that can only be lived within one's own psyche and that transforms us from within. It's when we touch this something greater that life gains new meaning, not because it becomes easier, but because it gains direction. And perhaps this is Jung's great legacy for our time: spirituality as reconnection with the self. An invitation to set aside ready-made certainties and dive into the mystery that inhabits us. Because deep down, what he was saying is that we are not lost. We've just forgotten how to listen. We've forgotten that there exists within us a center that knows, a voice that guides, a force that directs. Knowing God, then, is not knowing an answer. It's recognizing a call. And that call can begin now. Within you, like a memory, like a silence full of meaning, like a question that, being so deep, is almost an answer. If this journey through Jung's ideas has touched something within you, then perhaps your own process of reconnection with what is most true has already begun. Remember, the sacred is not outside. It pulses in every deep question, in every strange dream, in every emotion that insists on returning. Jung taught us that we don't need to seek ready-made answers. We need to learn to listen. And if this video has opened space for new reflections, you're on the right path. If you want to continue exploring these ideas with depth and awareness, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. This way you won't miss any new content, and you will continue with me on this journey of self-knowledge, spirituality, and inner transformation. Until our next dive.